So thank you very much for inviting me. I came into this conference at a rather late moment, so I've done my best to pull several things together, and I hope it's going to work. What I'm going to present today is based on an overview of the debate on toleration in the Dutch Republic in the 18th century, where I literally covered 1 century, from 1700 to 1800, and I read every text that had, even remotely anything to do with toleration, written or published within the Dutch Republic, but focusing on second-rate authors, because I think second-rate authors are much more interesting and important than the first-rate ones, because their influence, they're much more, on a lower level, they influence society much more easily. So that was the idea, and I'm going to retell that story in some ways, but I've adapted it to suit the interdisciplinary purposes of this conference, or at least the interdisciplinary setting of this conference, where not only historians are present, but also philosophers and theologians and legal historians and political scientists and so on and so on. So I'm going to be very imprudent for a historian towards the end of my lecture. To quote Manfred Finzelmer, because he apparently thinks that all historians are really prudent. Okay, so what I basically have is I don't have a text written out, but I do have a PowerPoint. Setting the stage, okay, so the Dutch Republic, why is the Dutch Republic interesting as a case? Well, it always has been interesting as a case, especially in the 17th century accounts of toleration, because of Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht of 1579, where it is written in a document which functioned more or less as the constitution of the Dutch Republic, which was basically a federal state of several republics, but I mean that's just complicating the issue. Basically the idea is that the Article 13 provided freedom of conscience to everybody within that republic. That meant in practice that people could really believe what they wanted to believe as long as they didn't express themselves publicly or didn't worship publicly, but they weren't persecuted for believing otherwise. So that is a distinction we usually make in Dutch history between a state church, where everybody is forced to go into, to belong to that state church, and a public church, which in the Dutch case was the Calvinist, the Reformed church, which was the dominant church, supported by the state, but you didn't need to be a member of that church. So that's what freedom of conscience does in the case of the Dutch Republic. Now, to give you some figures, just to get a feeling for this Dutch Republic, this is based on the census of 1809, where for the first time, people's religions were counted, on a population of about 2 million. You see that Catholics is quite a substantial minority. It's almost 40% of the population is Catholic in the Dutch Republic, which has this, well, it's no longer a republic at this moment, but it more or less reflects what happened, the situation in the 18th century. Catholics form a substantial minority in a republic that's always identified as being Calvinist. But that's because, of course, they reformed with 55%, which is an increase from the 17th century, 37%, was the majority of the population. But they're very, very small groups, but they're very influential. The Mennonites, Baptists, if you like, the descendants of the Anabaptists, the 16th century Anabaptists. The Lutherans, the Remonstrants especially, and there's always been a Jewish group. If you look at this in terms of toleration, and this is based on a late 18th century satire, you see Jews are the most difficult to tolerate, but Jews are put between brackets because they form a specific nation within the nation. So if we leave the Jews out, the Catholics are the most difficult to tolerate. The Reformed are the easiest, and you see the list of the groups in between. Lutherans are, for the Reformed, the easiest to tolerate, and so on. You can see the list. That's just to give you an impression of the situation in the Republic. Now, I want to begin with a kind of a definition of toleration, because it's probably the most messy term that was floating around in the early modern period. What does toleration mean? And I have. It's almost as messy as Enlightenment. Enlightenment is even more difficult to define. But I'm defining toleration simply as an accepting of differences. That's basically what it is. but based from what I'm quoting Manfred again, from a robust moral position to some extent. So, I mean, it's having values which you treasure, which you cherish, which you find important, and noticing people around you who don't have those values, and then say, okay, in spite of the fact that you don't share my values, I will tolerate you. So it's from a position of moral superiority. That's how toleration comes about, at least in this period and in the material I have looked at. I mean, it works in religion, but it also works in social situations, tolerating beggars in the street, tolerating prostitutes who are performing their profession around the corner. I mean, you can call the police and get rid of them, or you can tolerate them. So in a social sense, this works as well, but it also works in a religious sense, and it still works today. I mean, I used to have a heroin addict who lived, or almost lived, in the doorway to my house in Amsterdam when I lived in Amsterdam. So, I mean, you could tolerate this kind of situation, or you could not. Where I live now, I used to have a Moroccan neighbor who treats his wife, or who used to treat his wife, in a way my own wife wouldn't even let me think of treating her. So, I mean, what do? You can tolerate this kind of situation, or not. In the case of the heroin addict, I called the police, got rid of the heroin addict. In the case of the Moroccan neighbor, I moved to a wealthier neighborhood and solved the problem in that way. But it simply shows that toleration is difficult. I mean, living toleration is not easy. So that means that there is no inherent connection between toleration and enlightenment, or between toleration and religion. Toleration emerged from either the one or the other. It's a kind of like an anthropological constant. It's making do with a situation as it is. But it has its cultural limitations in any time or period, and that is what I'm really interested in, these cultural limitations. So religious toleration, that would be simply the acceptance of religious differences, by definition, given my definition of toleration as such, which from a Dutch or perhaps a European perspective may take different forms. It may take the form of the acceptance of slight variations within a family of closely aligned religious beliefs, and this is the way the Reformed, the Calvinists, defined toleration within their own community. There were variations, and they were willing to tolerate these variations to some extent, or not tolerate them. That was what the discussion was about. The Mennonites, probably the worst separatists of all in the 17th and 18th century Dutch Republic. They were divided into a countless number of groups. They had the same kind of policy. It might also mean, and this is another way of looking at it, the acceptance of different mainstream religions. So the Catholics, Calvinists, Lutherans, will you accept them within one country or not? There was this huge European discussion about this. It might mean the acceptance of religions other than Christianity, and the obvious case would perhaps be, at least today, Islam. And it might even mean the acceptance of non-religion, so anti-religion, unbelief, atheism, whatever you like to call it. And this is where the radical enlightenment might come in. Okay, so given this definition of religious toleration, you could then say it occurs top-down or bottom-up, or all at the same time, which theoretically I think would lead to at least four possibilities. You could say that they are imposed or regulated by secular powers, or that they emerge from below. So these four possibilities would be that secular authorities could impose religious toleration as a result of political expediency. The Edict of Nantes of 1598 would be an example of such a policy, but also the enlightened despot kind of person we discussed yesterday after Juan Pablo's lecture, people like Joseph II or Frederick I of Prussia. They imposed toleration from above. The secular authorities, and this is a second possibility, may officially or officiously regulate religious toleration simply to keep the peace, to prevent disunity from obstructing other more important social processes, such as obviously commerce, trade in the Dutch Republic. And given the fragmented nature of the Dutch Republic, this is the way toleration worked in the Netherlands. There was this important role of towns. If you were persecuted in one town, you simply went to the next. Religious toleration could be pursued as a policy, as an internal policy of religious groups, of churches, which I'll come back to later, because this was very important in the debates. But solving religious toleration as a matter of internal policy was also always involved politics, because it always had to do something with what I call the public sphere. So it's was always a very tricky question. And then there's religious toleration as simply, living apart together, daily life, which is non-politicized. It's what in the Netherlands Willem Vrijhof, who was my mentor some time ago, wrote about. But it's also what Ben Kaplan has been writing all about, how people make do in daily life. And often where there's a problem in theory, there needn't actually be a problem in practice. People simply live together. Now these differences are to some extent reflected in Dutch terminology, where tolerantie, the word tolerantie is derived from the Latin tolerantia, which could mean, which goes back to classical antiquity, and means things like passive acceptance or resignation to a situation which is simply there, but also to forbearance, which is more a New Testament term, which has connotations of brotherly love. We love our brothers and sisters in spite of the fact that they have values which are really not acceptable, but acceptable enough to tolerate. So then there are two ways of framing this whole debate about religious toleration in the 18th century, because the 18th century, in my definition, runs from 1670 to 1840, so it's a very long century. But around 1760, there's a change, and there's a change in frames. And then you could say that, okay, religious toleration, given the Enlightenment, is not quite compatible, or it may even be incompatible with what we tend to call Enlightenment. And this leads to a statement such as this: religious toleration is an obsolete practice that reflects the decreasing relevance of religion in modern society. Its decline is proportional to the rise of liberty, and it is incompatible with the enlightened notion of human rights. So if you have a development of an idea of human rights, then toleration becomes superfluous. And this is a statement I like by Thomas Paine, because he makes very clear upon which the issue hinges. Thomas Paine says that toleration is not the opposite of intolerance. No, he says it's its mirror image. Both intolerance and toleration are despotisms, he says. They're both wrong, both toleration and intolerance. The one assumes to itself the right of withholding liberty of conscience, that's intolerance, and the other one assumes to itself the right of giving it, as if you have the right to give somebody the freedom to practice a religion, which is already a human right by definition. So there is a tension here between religious toleration and the Enlightenment idea of human rights. The other frame, which is important to me as a cultural historian, because this limits the whole discussion about human rights, is that religious toleration is also limited by a vision of unity, or if you prefer the term which is often used by Charles, or used to be used by Charles Taylor, an imaginary. And this leads to a statement such as: unity in diversity and diversity in unity have always been the basis for and set the limits of toleration, including religious toleration. However, the period of the Enlightenment saw a fundamental shift in the way in which that unity could be defined. In other words, the way the collective is defined, the way an imaginary is defined, changes over time. And this is a change which happens in the 18th century. It's part of the discussion we had yesterday about the rhetoric and the argument remaining the same, but the motivation in the 18th century behind the rhetoric changing. So I think both claims obtain this tension between human rights and toleration, and this way toleration is limited by a vision of collective unity. They're both right. I mean, they both hold. They both obtain. But there's always a tension. There's always a problem. I mean, if everybody is equal, everybody has a number of rights. Which right gets precedence? So there's always a problem. People being more equal than others, given a specific vision of collective unity. I'm going to become less abstract in a minute. So the 18th century, especially the latter part, focused on the freedom of belief, or the right to believe whatever one wants to believe, but did so within a specific Christian context, and that is the vision of unity, which limits then the extent to which toleration can be done, in theory at least. there is this balance between cultural unity and cultural diversity. A cohesive society, because that's what I'm talking about, always requires this balance between unity and diversity. And the change in the 18th century in terms of this imaginary is a shift from what I call the confessional public sphere to the national public sphere. In a confessional public sphere, cultural unity is achieved through religious conformity or concord. That is the paradigm which people are discussing, religious conformity or concord. So you could find ways of solving this problem, or you could be against it, but it's the basic paradigm to which people relate in these debates. And in a national public sphere, which crops up in the later 18th century, cultural unity is not achieved through religious conformity, but through the notion of nationhood. Nationhood becomes really important. So, to put this another way, unity is achieved on the one hand through the imagined community of the confessional state, until 1760, after 1760, through the imagined community of the Christian nation. So this is a kind of mix of Foucault, who you mentioned yesterday, and Charles Taylor probably, but it works in the Dutch case. So to explain the Dutch case for you, this is the debate basically as it occurred until 1760, from 1670 to 1760. The imaginary or the vision of unity, which sets the cultural limits to toleration, is predicated on the idea that truth, and in this case religious truth, should manifest itself publicly through the power of the state. The power of the state is always involved somewhere, because religion is by definition a public thing. Now there are several debates, and I'm going through these very, very rapidly because I have other things to say as well. But this is basically the debate as it occurred until 1760. And there are different players in this debate. And the first set of players are the brothers and sisters, as I call them, within the public Reformed or Calvinist church. And the vision of unity underlying this part of the debate is that unity is given by the public church, which should preferably be a state church. I mean, the Orthodox Calvinists, they more or less accepted the idea that they did not live in an absolutist regime with a state church, but if you look deeply into their hearts, a state church would really be the best for humanity. It would be the best thing. As long as the state didn't meddle too much with the church. So that was their vision of unity. And you get this intra-Calvinist discussion among Orthodox supporters of a state-sponsored church. And in this respect, several cards were important at the time, but they're probably irrelevant to you. The Voetians and the Coxians, those of you who are versed in Dutch history might recognize these names. They're a brand of neo-scholasticism, Protestant neo-scholasticism, and anti-scholasticism, or Cartesians, on the other hand, who clashed several times. But they, so they had doubts about, they had differences on the way theology should be formulated, but they agreed on the fact that there should be a Calvinist church. You get an emphasis on fundamentalia, on fundamental doctrine as the basis for true brotherhood, and to live together, to tolerate each other within this church, requires the exercise of modesty, modestia, reasonableness, indulgence, patience leading to the mutual forbearance, mutua Christianorum, tolerantia, freedom of prophecy. So all these elements which are traditionally based on toleration are in there in this Orthodox debate. Another set of thinkers are the brothers and sisters in Christianity, and this is basically the unity is again defined as an Orthodox state church, but in this case the question was not, the discussion was not an intra-Calvinist discussion, but it was a discussion between mainstream Christian religions. So the Calvinists said, okay, if we want a state church, and this is in the 18th century, if we want a state church, and we want to survive as a state church in a continent that is wrecked by war most of the time, perhaps it would be a good idea to join forces with the Lutherans, to construct a single church with the Lutherans. And this is something many people don't recognize, is that there was a very active debate of trying to get the Calvinists and the Lutherans together in one church, in one state church in the Netherlands. This ties into German debates on Unionsbestrebungen at the time, which were very, very important, even if they didn't have much success. The same applies to the Dutch Republic. There were similar discussions with the Anglicans, with the Church of England at the time of William III, who was King of England for a while. And so the idea was to get the Dutch Calvinist Church and the Anglican Church together. That didn't have much success. Peter the Great came from Russia to the Dutch Republic once upon a time and had the same kind of discussion. Should the Dutch Calvinists and the Russian Orthodox form one church? Of course, that was even less successful. But what was interesting was the Calvinists and the Lutherans. It was really interesting for the Calvinists. But the problem is that they set the terms of the debate in a way that Lutherans couldn't possibly agree. They said Luther was really the first Calvinist. Right? Luther wasn't the first Lutheran, Luther was the first Calvinist. So they made Luther into a predestinarian, and they said, okay, on this basis we can become brothers and sisters in Christ, no problem. Of course, they conducted used all the official means. Synodal discussions, writing up of confessions, approval by the political authorities, of course, subscription by members, exactly in the way the Unionsbestrebungen, the search for unity, occurred in the German lands. But the German Lutherans themselves related theologically more easily, at least the left-wing Lutherans, more easily to the Arminians, who were, of course, for the Calvinists, heretics. And so the debates in the end were carried out by Lutherans and by left-wing Huguenots and other francophone writers like Jean Leclerc, Benedict Pictet, Jean-Alphonse Turrettini. They're all familiar names to 18th century scholars. So the Pietists, they accept this paradigm of a church being an external order which is supported in some way by the state. But they didn't care for it very much. They weren't really interested in the balance between unity and diversity. They simply wanted to do their thing, and that makes them dangerous to an orthodoxy which is in power. Especially because many of these pietists were very radical in a theological sense. They were antinomians, so they got their inspiration directly from above, and didn't care about social institutions and structures, which the Orthodox clergy found very important. These antinomians, you get them in all kinds in the early decades of the Dutch Republic, ranging from mystics, these Biemenists, followers of Jacob Böhme, this German mystic in the Netherlands, were very aggressive in their claim to being allowed to do their thing, their claim to liberty. So this set ranges from that kind of people to radical Spinozists, so people who we think or who claim to have read Spinoza. It's always very difficult, but who translated Spinoza into this mystical kind of sense, which made them dangerous because they didn't care for the structures that were in place, and they simply wanted to have their relation with God within a specific group. This applies especially to domestic pietists within the Calvinist Church. They started organizing themselves in sub-churches, you might say. So they agreed, okay, we're part of the Calvinist Church, but they organized themselves in groups. And again, they were seen as a danger by the mainstream Calvinists. So pietism is a very interesting part of the story because they disagreed with a paradigm, and they started an argument which you might call, with some imagination perhaps, a rights-based argument. We simply want to have the right to do our thing. Now you can, the discussion is much more complicated because you also have a search for unity, not within dissenting Protestant groups, but by dissenting Protestant groups. So this is a search for Protestant unity rather than Calvinist unity. The dissenting groups who search for this kind of toleration, they base themselves on early 17th century Arminian theories of toleration developed in that period by Hugo Grotius and Episcopius and the like, with an emphasis on freedom of public religious practice for all denominations, preferably within one church, which would ultimately also include Catholics, or which could include Catholics. This was an idea which doesn't return in the 18th century, but which does occur in the 17th century, based on the consensus quique secularis, also the agreement of the first 500 years of Christianity, where, you know, if whether you're Protestant or Catholic, in those first 500 years it's easy to find some terms of agreement. So why all the fuss? It's a discussion about fundamentals and adiaphora. The means again are colloquia and synods, and the terminology used again is familiar: concordia, peace, brotherhood, comprehension, indulgence, what have you. But the focus is then on a much broader Protestant union. You get a lot of influence from English latitudinarians, names like John Davenant, William Chillingworth, John Tillotson, Wilbert Burnett in the 17th century, and Benjamin Hoadley, John Locke, of course. And John Locke's reasonableness of Christianity is much more important than the letter on toleration in the Netherlands. You get an influence from Swiss Reformed theologians like Jean Leclerc, Jean-Alphonse Turrettini, Samuel Werenfels, Jean-Frédéric Osterwald. Not sure whether the names are familiar, but they were important at the time within the Calvinist context. And then there's the last group, the anti-clerical liberals, critics of the organized clergy, who tie in again with your story, Juan Pablo. They are search for a Protestant unity. That is the cultural limit they set. It has to be a Protestant state church, so no Catholics, please. But they say they have a very strong focus on the state. The state is a powerful force in making this work. So this ties into the latitudinarian kind of critique of the church's autonomy. It continues Erastian debates. It is the state rather than the church that ensures the maintenance of a very limited number of fundamentals of faith. And you see quite a few Republican magistrates or politicians, people in power, who emphasize this kind of secular control over the Orthodox Church, or people who are in networks of power. So it's quite an important group. And you also see, and that's also interesting, natural law scholars who work at universities, or actually the people who teach the people who later become the magistrates who have the political power. So this is quite an important part of the debate. There is sometimes some influence of Spinoza, and there's a whole range of the way this Protestant unity can be defined, from very lenient to quite orthodox. But the important point is that the state power really is crucial. And then you get the change. So the Enlightenment comes up. You get a new imaginary, a new focus. Or at least something I call the Enlightenment for lack of a better word, because the Enlightenment, of course, as such, is a 19th century construction. The term Enlightenment doesn't occur in English in the 18th century. In the Netherlands, all the people who are, known as the great enlighteners today, Voltaire, for example, only the plays of Voltaire were read in the 18th century. Voltaire, as a critic of the church, only became important in the 19th century. So this whole Enlightenment is basically a 19th century construction, but it's an interesting one. But nevertheless, there is a change in the 18th century, which you could call the Enlightenment if you like. I call it the enlightened alternative. And the imaginary, the cultural limits of toleration, the vision of unity, whatever you want to call it, is predicated on the idea that truth should be internalized by free citizens. So it's not an external institution which is imposed, or which is imposed in part by the state. And you have this church-state relationship, however you would like to define it. No, it has to be internalized by free citizens. So you get the idea of a nation of free believers in a liberal in a kind of left-wing sense, so not, or kind of a heterodox sense perhaps. A nation of free believers in a liberal, historically rooted Protestant tradition. The ideal then is a nation of reasonable, sociable, preferably religious citizens. A nation of Protestant Christians, which is something different. It leads to political programs which are connected with a call for representation in government. Of course, as you know, the French Revolution, which is the revolution everybody's always talking about, was preceded by the American Revolution, but it was also preceded by the revolution in Utrecht, where I come from, 1786. There was actually a revolution there which preceded the French Revolution, and of course, in that sense, was much more important. But the people who are in that kind of debate, they talk about free citizens who are liberated from prejudice and educated to pursue truth independently and become inwardly convinced of religious truth, but religious truth is defined as the sufficiency of the Protestant sola scriptura. So that is it is a cultural limitation which is imposed on the idea of the free citizen. But you have to educate citizens, right? So there's a very strong focus on education. The assumption is that free and enlightened citizens, informed, educated citizens, liberated from the yoke of the clergy, would bring about a national form of Christian unity, or, if you like, a Christian nation. So this means the pursuit of a moderate, liberal Christianity. There's a lot of influence from Germany. The neologians, if that, I'm not sure if that is a term that resonates. The neologians were theologians who did new things, that's why the term neologians, but those new things were dangerous. I mean, they said things like, Trinity is kind of an invention which was made some point in time, but it's of no relevance to us today. So that was something the Orthodox clergy did not like. So there's a strong focus on fundamentals of faith, a very moderate historical criticism. So it's kind of an anticipation of the 19th century. There's a huge output of apologies for Christianity, because the citizens, the new citizens, need to be educated. For this, you need to have some form of religion. So apologies for Christianity start being written, but these are apologies for a very liberal kind of Christianity. So it's a very limited kind of Christianity if you look at it from an Orthodox perspective. So you've got to focus on, I'll skip a bit, but on these attributes which you see listed here. Doctrinal simplicity. So fundamental articles which have always been there suddenly become very important again, because the less doctrine, the more inclusion. It implies at this point in time a complete rejection of predestination, which is a fundamental doctrine underlying, you might say, Calvinist orthodoxy. There's an emphasis on the moral life, on the idea that practicing virtue is much better than doctrinal speculation. There's a distinction which comes from Germany between theology and religion. Theology is doctrines, is institutions, it's formularies, it's scholasticism, but religion is simple biblical truths of which we can all easily agree and which have a bearing on morality. There's a focus on sincerity. Inward conviction is much better than semblance or hypocrisy. Again, this is a much older discussion, but it comes up. I mean, the way religion was organized before 1760, this first paradigm, was external. So people felt obliged to keep up appearances. So outwardly you conform, but inwardly you believe otherwise. And after 1760, this distinction is gotten rid of very quickly, and there is a claim to the right to sincerity and candor, to express openly one's convictions. And if you like a bit of digital humanities, this is from Google Ngram. And you can see how sincerity, after 1760, in an English language context, so this is not Dutch, so you can see how broad the discussion is. I mean, this Dutch case is representative, I think, of things which are happening outside the Dutch Republic. You see that sincerity, dissimulation, candor, those kinds of notions suddenly come up after 1760. They were there before, but the rise is interesting. I have more of these graphs if you'd like to see them. Reasonableness, the reasonableness of Christianity, a balance between reason and revelation becomes very important. Again, that's an older discussion, but it crops up again. An emphasis on piety and heartfelt piety, on inner convictions as they work within your heart. A focus on the common man as the person who should be educated, as the new citizen, as the constituent part of the new nation, which leads to a huge amount of missionary activities. Protestant missionaries start trying to reach out to the common man, to educate that person, and work from within the individual, again, to construct a citizen, a new citizen. And this leads me then to Enlightenment as a term which didn't exist in the Dutch context at the time, but the term that did exist and which meant exactly the same is the term, first of all, the term opklaring, which is a literal translation from the German Aufklärung, and Aufklärung is the German word for enlightenment, which basically meant civilization, being educated, finally coming to grips with truth, because we know we can access truth now, because we have the instruments. We can read the Bible critically, we can identify these minimal doctrines. We need to be pious and good Christians. So the Dutch term then would be, which is identical to enlightenment, is at this point in time, is verlichting, which literally means enlightenment, but also beschaving, which literally means civilization. So civilization and enlightenment were simply interchangeable at this point. A civilized citizen is an enlightened citizen, is an educated citizen. So the idea of the nation then affords new boundaries based on reasonableness, on moderation, and basically a kind of liberal Protestantism, which brings about a nation of free, but therefore by definition, liberal Protestant believers, which then of course leads to the exclusion of other groups. And this whole story of toleration begins again. Now if we return to the two frames, which is this a bit, and remember the two frames were, the first one was the tension between using the frame of rights and saying that religious toleration isn't is incompatible with the Enlightenment if you define it as something which has to do something with the idea of people being equal, people having the same human rights. That would be one frame which leads to a tension, and the other frame is the idea of unity, which has to be defined culturally in some way, and which leads to tensions, and there's a balance that has to be achieved here. What you see in the later 18th century is this growing emphasis or a focus on freedom of belief, or the right to believe whatever one wants to believe, but within this liberal Protestant context. So you see that the rights-based frame is limited by a cultural frame, and this leads then to the effective exclusion. And this really happened in the early 19th century. The exclusion of, well, first of all, unbelievers, but unbelievers only became acceptable towards the end of the 19th century, more or less publicly, than in the Netherlands. But especially Catholics were put outside the political, social context quite even more strictly than they had been put outside before. And Orthodox Protestants were, their voice was minimalized because the new nation was predicated on this liberal Protestantism. Which leads to all kinds of problems, which is a part of complicated Dutch history, which I won't bother you with. So there's this shift, and that's the other frame, from the imagined community of the confessional state to the imagined community of the Christian nation. And the imagined community of this Christian nation sees some groups as unnational, and therefore is either willfully backward. I mean, you're willfully backward. You don't want to be educated. That is what the Protestants said to the Catholics after 1760. When in the spirit of the Enlightenment, you Dutch Catholics, you remain yoked to the Pope. You don't want to read the Bible. We recognize you as Dutch, but you are a lower kind of Dutch person, and therefore you should be excluded from society. So there is a discussion about the possibilities of toleration there. So either willfully backward, or even, and then it gets dangerous, disloyal. I mean, if your loyalty is with the Pope and not with the state, then okay, that's another reason for exclusion. So my main story is that there is this shift in the age of the Enlightenment, for what it's worth, the term, which connects to all kinds of notions we do have of what an Enlightenment could be or should be or ought to be, etc. But it's difficult to pinpoint it, to make it really clear what it is. But I've tried to identify it as this shift from a confessional framework to a national framework. But having said that, you also see that the problem of religious toleration isn't solved. It's something that continues over time until the present day. And the last slide I have is this one, where I've tried to look from the present day to see, I mean, what does history bring us? Having looked at the 18th century, okay, interesting story to tell, the Dutch case, lots of things happen. I've made a claim that there's a shift after 1760, but how do we use this for the present? So what I've tried to do is look at several for contemporary perspectives seen through the Netherlands, through the newspapers, if you like, of the kinds of discussions that are going on now about toleration. And the first one may be interesting to point out because it's a communitarian model. It is at this moment supported by small religious groups, either Orthodox Calvinists who have this long tradition, or Orthodox Catholics. It's a communitarian model which harks back to the first part of the 17th century, when Dutch society, much like German society, was divided into quite specific ideological groups, religious or political groups. And the idea is there that people belong to collectives which are equal. These collectives are equal, so that's why it's a corporatist model. We can accept the differences between these collectives as long as they are collectively accepted, and the result is a kind of a corporate forbearance. So this is the political model these small religious groups still try to achieve, but it basically the way Dutch society was structured until the 1960s, when everything blew up and the Netherlands gained this reputation of being the most tolerant society in the world, a reputation which it has lost over the past 10 years. There's the multicultural model, of course, where all individuals are equal and therefore all their cultural identities are of equal standing, so that accepting all divergent ideas and practices is a moral good, and the result is kind of a total forbearance, which isn't toleration anymore, because it's simply an acceptance of equality everywhere. So without making a judgment, it has nothing to do with toleration, because everything is equal, so you accept everything. And the problem of the 1990s, of course, was how do you run a society wherein everything can be accepted? In the Netherlands, in any case, it didn't work politically. So there are two other models, a neo-libertarian model, which is kind of the neo-conservative model, if you like. There are neo-conservative populist politicians in the Netherlands who have this kind of view. They say that freedom is part of the Western heritage, that cultural identities are therefore by definition unequal, because the people who are more equal are the people who adhere to this Western Enlightenment heritage, which is rights-based. So that we shouldn't accept divergent ideas, because it's an avoidable evil. What we need to do is simply enforce equality everywhere. And that is a kind of a neo-conservative model, which doesn't work either, because there are groups which feel pressure, which aren't happy with this, and they start doing things which they shouldn't do, but which is partly brought about by the social pressure which is working on them. And then there's the final one is the inegalitarian model, which probably is based partly on the writings of John Gray. I'm not sure if John Gray is known here. Individuals are free, but cultural identities are unequal, and this is simply a fact of life. People are unequal. Live with it. So find a modus vivendi, he says, it's inescapable. Accepting divergent ideas and practices is a necessary evil. It's simply, we need to do this whether you like it or not, and that leads to kind of pragmatic conservatism, and then back to the idea of, toleration as it was used. The term was used at the beginning of my story.